So good morning, everyone. So today I have the pleasure to wake you up. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. My name is Hanna Voss. I work as a program manager at Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and I have the pleasure of guiding you through the next 75 minutes as we take a closer look at a question that we already touched a couple of times yesterday and feels more pressing than ever. What choices does Iran have? A lot has shifted in recent months with Israel's war against Hezbollah in Lebanon and the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. Iran's regional network, known as the Axis of Resistance, is under pressure like never before. And at the same time, Iran is dealing with deep internal challenges. President Masoud Pezeshkian is trying to walk a very fine line, offering some social openness at home while signaling interest to the West of reviving talks and gaining sanctions relief. We also have Donald Trump back to the White House in January, and with him also he brought back his maximum pressure approach towards Iran. What all that means, and to help us unpack all this, and also to explore what room for maneuver Iran really has in this moment, we're joined by two fantastic panelists. We have Dr. Hamidreza Azizi joining us from Berlin. I mean, both as it's a tradition now at the Beirut security debates, the Iran panel is mostly hybrid, but yeah. So we have Dr. Hamidreza Azizi joining us from Berlin, visiting fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP. He also serves as a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs in Doha. His research focuses on security and geopolitical issues in the Middle East and Central Eurasia, Iran's foreign and security policy, and Iran-Russia relations. And we have Arash Azizi joining from New York, I think, right?
Boston.
So it's both. Right, it's 3 a.m. 3 a.m. at this point. That's so right. An even bigger thank you, for joining us at such an hour. That's, we really appreciate it. Arash is a visiting fellow at Boston University's Pardee Center and an incoming lecturer at Yale University. He's a contributing writer at The Atlantic, and he also publishes in numerous other outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. So hello and welcome to you both. So before we dive into the core question of the panel, which is what choices does Iran have, I'd like to ask Hamid and Arash both to help us set the scene a bit. And to start with Hamid, with your expertise in Iran's foreign policy and strategic outlook, could you start us off with how you see Iran's position regionally and internationally right now in April 2025 after the developments of the recent month?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Many thanks for inviting me to Beirut Security Debates once again. And it's a pity that, again, I couldn't make it to the conference in person. I really hope that next year I can be there and see you all, not from afar, not virtually, but in person. So speaking of Iran's position, there are things that, of course, is quite evident in terms of the setbacks for Iran's regional network, the Axis of Resistance, Iranian allies across the region being under immense and unprecedented pressure and so on. But in order to give a kind of more comprehensive picture of how Iran sees itself now in terms of the challenges, potential opportunities, and also the kind of options that it has. We need to concentrate maybe on the developments, specifically speaking, the second half of 2024 onwards. Because before that, and since October 7, 2023, there was a sense in Iran that the investment that they had on the Axis of Resistance, this whole regional network, the strategy of forward defense or extraterritorial deterrence that they had developed for decades, that these steps and these investments actually are kind of, bearing fruits, and that now is the time for Iran to actually expand its regional influence. But then Since April, of course, the Israeli attack on Iranian consulate in Damascus, the first signs of kind of shrinking space for Iranian influence and Iranian status in the region started to appear. And then especially after the unprecedented and surprising events in Lebanon for Hezbollah, the whole scene started to change. And the climax, the peak of it was actually October 2024 strikes, the Tit Tortal attacks, and then especially end of October when Israel conducted massive attacks against Iranian military infrastructure. That showed actually quite a few things in terms of the strategic constraints that Iran was facing. First of all, it was an indication that after all those setbacks, and at least for the time being, and in the foreseeable future, the so-called axis of resistance is not going to maintain deterrence for Iran, and especially the weakening of Hezbollah, because if you look at the past few years, for example, compare the current international environment surrounding Iran, where there's a lot of talk about diplomacy between Iran and the United States, or a confrontation. It was kind of similar to the period between 2009, 2010, and 2015, the signing of the JCPOA, or better to say 2013, when the first steps toward the deal was taken. But the difference is that, at that time, when there was talks about all options being on the table, a military strike or whatever options in terms of military steps that were discussed, there was always this concern that Hezbollah being there right on the Israeli borders, it's going to be quite tough to even speak and think of a military strike against Iran. Now the October strikes, and especially the kind of unwillingness or inability, in a sense, of Iran to respond in kind to those strikes, showed that, as I said, first of all, the weakening of Hezbollah has led to the loss of the deterrence, in the sense that Israel feels the freedom to strike deep inside the Iranian territory. And second, that together with that deterrence, the offensive capabilities that could inflict meaningful damage to the adversaries, that's also lost, because everything, the whole military doctrine was kind of defined around this idea of forward defense or offensive defense. So it didn't mean, my main point is that the weakening of the axis of resistance, be it Hamas not being able to engage with Israel in the same quantity and quality as in the past, or Hezbollah or other actors, it doesn't only mean the weakening of, for example, Iran's ideological or strategic influence in the region. It has serious and direct repercussions for Iranian security itself. So this is the first part and most serious part, actually, of the picture. And afterwards, and we may go into the details of that, there has been a process of rethinking not only the Iranian regional strategy in general, but in particular the military doctrine that has defined Iran's kind of actions and sort of interactions with different actors in the region over the past decades. So this is the first part. The second part is Iran's relative weakness. I mean, kind of in a comparative perspective, when we look at the changing geopolitics, especially in the Levant, Iran's relative weakness vis-a-vis actors like Turkey, and especially Turkey. So again, this goes beyond just losing, for example, Syria to a serious regional rival, which is Turkey. It also has repercussions. If you look at the strategic narrative, if you look at the debates in Tehran, there's growing concern about the potential implications, for example, for Iran's standing and influence in another neighboring region, which is the South Caucasus. So, and also in Iraq. This has raised Iran's threat perception of Turkey in the past few months, like never before, I would say, in the period after, at least after the Arab Spring developments, and even maybe now stronger than at that time. So
maybe
in
Hanna,
that sense,
just let me quickly jump into here, because that is interesting. And before I ask Arash, so how is that, what you already also touched on, perceived domestically, also, you know, support of still the axis of resistance, also like the members of the axis of resistance, and how this whole like foreign strategy is perceived internationally. What I would like to ask you, what you already also kind of hinted, what does, or like how can Tehran regain its influence, and what is it doing at the moment to like try to reposition itself in the Middle East? I remember when we discussed how to name this panel, we were even thinking, should we call it "What choices does Iran have?" Because, you know, some people would argue they don't have any. It's basically kind of decided what's going to happen. Either going to be bombed or they agree to anything in a kind of deal. We'll talk about that in a bit. But how do you see that? I mean, like how are they trying to adapt and to cope with the losses that they were facing? And also, are they really as weak as now many commentators and analysts predict?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was going to be my last point, actually, in a couple of minutes. Just to conclude on this part, as I said, tensions with Turkey at the diplomatic level, it's already growing, and it might actually lead to some actual geopolitical, I wouldn't say kind of actual conflicts, but at least frictions between the sides, indirect conflict. And finally, of course, Arash will discuss the domestic implications of maximum pressure, but the regional dimension of maximum pressure, especially when it comes to Iraq, is another very concerning development for Iran. Because, you know, one thing is clear. For Iran, Iraq is different than all other areas where it has had kind of influence. Given the geography, given the kind of fact that, you know, they share a long border, and you know, the conflict that they had for 8 years with Iraq, it is really considered as part of the national security of the country. The developments of Iraq, the developments in Iraq cannot be just considered as not having effects on Iran. So Trump administration activities like trying to sort of dismantle or at least limit the role of the popular mobilization forces, Hashd al-Shabi, in Iraq and so on. So these are the areas where actually basically the topics, the developments that adds to Iran's concern. So from here, speaking of Iran's choices, actually, despite all the challenges, there has been a bright spot, and that's been Iran's rapprochement with Arab states in the Persian Gulf. Actually, it happened quite at the right moment, I would say, in March 2023, a few months before the start of the war on Gaza. And in that sense, and the fact that despite all the tensions in the region, the rapprochement stayed intact somehow, and actually they have been quite sort of, I mean, the level of engagement has been actually growing between Iran and especially Saudi Arabia. That's the brightest spot, especially now that Iran apparently wants to reach an agreement with the United States. It is very important because back in 2015, it wasn't just Israel, but also Saudi Arabia, which was trying to exert influence on the United States not to allow a deal to happen. And now Saudi Arabia is actually somehow signaling willingness to mediate between Iran and Trump. So the geopolitical landscape in terms of the patterns of amity and enmity, to borrow from the English school, the patterns of amity and enmity in the Gulf are changing, and that's a positive sign in terms of sort of reduced threats at immediate neighborhood for Iran. So just in a minute, if I may, three scenarios. One is, to continue the same policy that they did before, and there are people who advocate for that in Iran, what they call anti-systemic game, kind of trying to actually double down on asymmetric methods to make it difficult for other actors like Turkey, like the United States in the region, resorting to what's left of the axis of resistance, like Iraqi militias, etc., to basically destabilize the region. That doesn't seem like what Iran is trying to do at the moment. Second scenario is, so that is what I would call the maximalist approach. The minimalist approach would be for Iran to cope with, to adapt to the new realities and go for a kind of political role instead of military and security role, trying to reach out to the current governments, not only in Lebanon, but also in Syria, trying to constrain the Iraqi militias, trying to exert influence on the Houthis and so on. If a comprehensive deal with the United States happens, which I don't think that's going to be the case, it's even if there is an agreement, I would say it would be limited in scope. But if there is a comprehensive understanding, at least, there's potential for Iran to go toward that scenario. And finally, there's a scenario in between, which is which has a short-term and a long-term perspective. In the short term, and this seems to be the kind of more likely scenario. In the short term, Iran is going to concentrate on the political game in order to buy time, to rethink its whole strategy, to rebuild its allies, and so on, and also to fend off the threat, to avoid a war with the United States and so on, and then to build on this political influence in the longer term to rebuild its kind of regional influence. But in any case, forward defense has shown its limits, and I don't believe that the future role of Iran is going to be exactly the same as it was in the past. So more like Iran at the center of this network of partnerships, not necessarily kind of directing these groups militarily, but using them mostly as a tool for expansion of regional influence. And regional influence, I mean, broadly speaking, not just in terms of military and asymmetric tactics. For military, more advanced missiles, and a focus on, for example, a naval deployment and naval expansion. These are the things that we are already witnessing. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamid. I mean, we also already talked about yesterday that it's a bit the time of also flexibility in diplomacy at this point, right? You also have to, maybe find new alliances, which Iran also has been trying to do. I mean, the second option or scenario that you portrayed is also like, maybe even reaching out to this new government in Syria, which probably would not be as close as it was to the Assad regime, but it could still maybe be some kind of a relationship. Arash, turning to you. So exactly, we want to know where does Iran stand domestically after the developments of the past few months? These all these events that also Hamid mentioned almost simultaneously unfolded with Masoud Pezeshkian's assumption of office, not fully. I mean, Raisi died in that helicopter crash in May, but like almost. And he's a reformist president who promised to ease social restrictions, pursue rapprochement with the West. So I want to ask you, how are his promises holding up in the current context? Also, maybe talk about the economic situation in the country. Now, also that Trump has resumed the maximum pressure policy, which also means a tightening of sanctions. And then I would also like to know how, in all this, does the public perceive the foreign policy or the foreign strategy of the regime? I mean, still, also using maybe resources for those allies and members of the Axis of Resistance, while also these resources could be really urgently needed inside the country.
Well, sure. Thank you very much, Hanna. It's great to be here. You guys can hear me, right?
Yes.
All right, great. It's great to be here. I wish I was there in person as well. I was actually kind of quite excited. Unfortunately, couldn't make it to the scheduling issues, but I hope to have I've been to Beirut many times, and I hope to return sometime soon, and to the AUB actually, and I hope to have the opportunity to return sometime soon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the domestic situation, as you said, in light of this regional events, and I want to talk about a few things here that are relevant to our conversation. So first of all, the situation between different factions of the regime. Factionalism has always been very important to the Islamic Republic. I think a lot of time this issue is not quite apparent to some outsiders. It's also the case that a lot of people have ideological stakes in wanting to portray this one way or the other, which is, I'm as ideological as anybody else, but, if it becomes a blindfold which you cannot see, it's a problem, right? So people go out of their way to say, no, they're all the same. Or they go out of their way to say, no, they're so radically different. The reality, though, is that there are different factions in the Islamic Republic, and they do follow drastically different policies. What we should remember is that, of course, they're also in the middle of a historic battle with each other in a way, because Ayatollah Khamenei, who will turn 86 in a couple of days, in a couple of weeks, right? Later this month, he will turn 86 years old. He's going to die, right? This is the end. This is the end of his life. So there's a succession crisis already. Yeah. Now, it's quite fascinating, these internal factions. I usually analyze them as three broad factions. That is the reformist, the centrist, and the conservatives, or the hardliners. Actually, I should say the hardliners, centrists, and the reformists. And the centrists include a lot of the conservatives. And to sort of sum the situation up, of course, the reformist and centrist, what unites them is they believe that Iran's anti-West, anti-Israel foreign policy has been a historical blunder, if I put it bluntly. They basically consider it a blunder, at least in the way that it has been followed, and they want it to change. Now, not everybody in this camp agrees with this, but they generally, this is, they might not see it as big of a blunder, but they are revisionist in this regard. They want to change these policies, and they believe that Iran should focus on its economic development, which they believe it relies on giving up some of these policies. And the hardliners, of course, are opposed to that. They believe that Iran has ideologically followed this Islamic revolutionary path. That means opposing the West and never compromising with the US, wanting to destroy Israel, and it should continue to do that. Now, anyways, there are caveats about this, and about also, so this is sort of a political division, but then different security circles in the Islamic Republic, they don't always think on this political ideological line. Sometimes they're thinking very pragmatically in terms of deterrence, and they suggest policies in this way. But the interbalance of these factions will always matter. And I think when we're talking about the current situation, one important factor to remember is that, in my estimation, the hardliners are not doing very well. Basically, they are politically weakened, and the centrists have quite sort of wind in their sails, if you will. Now, the reformists are also pretty marginalized, actually, in a way, and we'll talk about that, about the administration of President Pezeshkian and some of the limits it has. But it's important to remember that in many ways, hardliners in Iran are relatively sidelined. They're believed to be troublemakers. They're believed to cause trouble for potential negotiations that, well, not potential anymore, negotiations that Iran will have with the Trump administration starting on Saturday. I think that's an important, so this is an important thing to remember. And let me just point out to two important pieces of evidence, about their marginalization. In the past few days, Kayhan newspaper, known as a hardliner outlet in Tehran, ran a story joking around with assassination of President Trump, and it got an official reprimand from the authorities, and it's been under attack. So of course, there's also the case of, believe it or not, there was a hijab demonstration in Iran which was suppressed, and this was not a anti-hijab demonstration. It was a pro-hijab demonstration that was repressed officially. That is, it was a gathering of people in support of the mandatory hijab. Basically, these are people who came out wanting a more a stringent enforcement of hijab rules in Iran, in particular this hijab bill that has gone on. And the government had to suppress them, had to literally send vans around, and didn't quite arrest them, but basically dispersed them around and sent them to different places. This all shows to that weakening of the hardliners that we can also talk about in more details as to what I really mean by this. Now, about the economy. The economy is in a dire state. The Iranian rial has, in the last few weeks, have traded at, so the US dollar has sold for more than 1 million Iranian rials. Now, I remind everybody, when President Pezeshkian took office less than a year ago, it was 600,000. Last time I left, sort of Iran, I remember that I had to buy, I think it was, I believe it was 6,000, 7,000, something like that, right? So this is how drastic of so it was 600,000 under Pezeshkian. It was like drop a zero to when I left, 10, 15 years ago, and of course now it's more than 1 million. So this just gives you an idea of the collapse of the Iranian economy, and also indicative is that just since when we know there have been talks with the US, like when they declared that there will be talks on Saturday, this news alone rallied the Iranian rial by about 5%. So this just shows you how closely it is tied to the prospects there. To the economic situation is quite dire. There are serious long-term problems. There is just in the past few months, the Iranian electricity has been often cut.
Yes.
So did you want me to stop here, or you're...
No. I just when you said because that's also something that I've read many times now, even in Tehran, and so even I know that they use kind of planned power cuts in the past to save some energy. Now they also unpredicted, unplanned power cuts. We all know here this very well, but this also happens in Tehran, in the capital now. So I was also I wanted to ask you, in such dire economic conditions. Does President Pezeshkian actually have any room to maneuver? Can he deliver meaningful reforms? Or is his presidency already, let's say, constrained by structural limits and internal resistance also? You mentioned the hardliners, although they are, a bit fragmented at the moment, but still, of course, he faces this opposition. And also maybe combined with that question, and then we move to the US and the talks on Saturday, Pezeshkian's reformist or centrist, whatever predecessor, not his direct predecessor, that was Raisi, but the one from the reformist camp, Hassan Rouhani, was able to negotiate the nuclear deal with a certain degree of political space because, Khamenei supported the initiative to a certain extent, delegated the diplomatic track to him. Today, the situation for him also appears quite different. Like, it seems like his room to maneuver is much more limited. So I was also wondering, so in general, what room to maneuver does he have? Why is that? And what implications might that have for the upcoming negotiations?
For sure. Yeah. So I should first of all say that I know that electricity cuts are sort of a regular event in Beirut, as we know, but in Iran they really were not. That was not a thing that happened before last year. Like they happened, very sporadically, right? Maybe a couple of times a year in electricity would be cut, but to have this massive sort of planned and unplanned electricity cuts that have really sort of destroyed, economically a lot of people. I mean, this was not a thing that was normal. And also government officially shut down tons of businesses for like half the week, which, also but itself is an indicative of how terrible the situation is. But also it was interesting interviewing people, talking to them. A lot of them were like, yeah, whatever, we'll stay half the week home because it's not like there was much economic activity going on anyways, right? So it also really shows you, and, we're talking about a country like Iran with 90 million people, with, sort of significant economic activity in the past, right? This is a country that, whose GDP, was not far from, let's say, Indonesia not that long ago, right? GDP per capita. And then, now it's in this sort of situation. So the dire economic state explains why Iran finds itself at the negotiation table. Now, as to the issue of Pezeshkian government, let me put it in these terms. So the story of Pezeshkian is this. He has his domestic agenda. He has a few sort of domestic agenda points. One of them was, of course, he came into power in the aftermath of the Women Life Freedom movement in Iran, which had been sparked around the issue of mandatory hijab. And in Iran, in the past couple of years, we've seen a massive campaign of civil disobedience that has changed the face of Iran. If you take a picture today on the streets of Tehran, and you will see, and I sort of FaceTime with family, all the time. What you see is a Tehran unlike, any that Hamidreza and I would have seen, in the years before. I.e., there are tons of Iranian women who are refusing to wear the hijab. Now, this is not because they're allowed to. The people are still banned. They're sometimes arrested. The worst thing is that cafes, for example, that continue to serve women without hijab might be closed down. Bookstores, establishments have been closed down. So in no way is it that the government has sort of give a green light on this, but at the same time, it has not gone on to repress also this wide phenomenon. So there's this in-between situation. And there is a hijab bill. And so let me just very briefly say this. So there's the hardliners.
It hasn't gone through the parliament. Like they didn't enforce. Let's say.
Well, it did go through the parliament.
But they didn't.
Actually, so it was voted in by the. So it's a kind of a strange legal situation. So it went through the parliament. It went through the Guardian Council. It went through the experience. It passed all the legal, basically, hurdles. And the Speaker of the Parliament, Ghalibaf, who is a conservative, but I argue now sides with the centrist, he basically proclaimed this, right? So it passed all the hurdles, but it basically is not being implemented.
Yeah,
and at some point, Pezeshkian said the national security. That's right. Yeah. So he said the National Security Council has decided not to implement it, and even some very hardliner MPs, they effectively defended the repression of these pro-hijab protesters that I talked about, and they said, this is obviously not in national interest right now. So that's one domestic sort of point of Pezeshkian government. The other point that is important is the restrictions of the internet, which he has not been able to lift a lot. He lifted a little. He, for example, he lifted the ban on Google Play. I don't know whether anybody remembers what Google Play is, right? So it's like obviously not the most important platform, but it kind of mattered because you could get VPNs on Google Play and all that. So it is to say that he's done a couple of things. his finance minister, Hemmati, was impeached by the parliament. And also his very controversial and well-known and larger-than-life figure of Jawad Zarif, his vice president, was forced to resign allegedly because he has American children, because he was a student in America when his children were born. Anyways, so what I'm trying to get here, what I'm trying to say here is that so he's been pretty curtailed in his domestic agenda, and the reality is the most important issue though is not any of this, is the economy, and the economy depends on foreign affairs. And let me just quote there and say, President Pezeshkian has, with a bit of exaggeration, I would say, has as much say on this big foreign affairs matter as anyone attending, your conference today in Beirut, right? It's totally irrelevant. He is kind of an invisible figure. He was a nice constituency MP before. He was health minister, million years ago under the Khatami government. He is not the type of figure who can, the best he can do is speak up in the National Security Council meetings for a particular position. And early on, there was the idea that, maybe he could, because he has very good relations with Supreme Leader Khamenei, he could be assertive or play a role. But I think he's overwhelmed by the position. And I speak to people around him. I think he's been overwhelmed by the position. He sort of finds himself as having been given this very thankless job and at this very moment. So, but the National Security Council is really what is deciding things in a way. So, I don't know, where I want to take this sort of conversation, but if I say something as a sort of wrapping up these initial remarks, is to say that the domestic situation in Iran is dire, and the economic situation is dire. The potential for social unrest is there, although it's also the fact that the Iranian opposition, the opponents of the regime, have, failed so royally, no pun intended, of trying to gather a sort of a serious force.
And we also have these conflicts, let's say, in the northwest of the country, or these, let's call them ethnic conflicts, unresolved ethnic conflicts that also then mean an opportunity for external actors like Turkey, like Azerbaijan, to also jump onto it. So also this opens always room for Iran, that's uncertainty, and also, their internal struggles as well there. But they're also connected to external struggles. So, yeah.
So I'm glad that you pointed that out. In the northwest of Iran, there has been some clashes between Kurdish and Iranian Azeris, which we usually use the term Turks, right? So the Turkic and Kurdish Iranians in the northwestern Iran. Now, I would say that these are a level of this has always gone on. I would also say that it has not developed to the level of sort of ethno-sectarian sort of problems that we can see in other countries in the region, or I don't think it's that bad basically, and I don't think it has, but it's definitely a sort of very worrying sign, right? And it could develop further, especially if, as you mentioned, Turkey or Azerbaijan want to play a harder role there. Now, historically, that hasn't happened for the very basic reason that they know it's a game that goes both ways, right? Iran could do things in the Republic of Azerbaijan or in Turkey that, would be detrimental to those countries' sort of stability. And I don't think so. I haven't really gone there, but it's a point of concern. Anyways, but to as I said, to wrap up this conversation, is that all of this has pushed Iran to want to get a deal and negotiate. So, exactly. And there is some sort of a will in Tehran on this issue.
Coming to that deal, or that negotiations for now, Hamid, what we're seeing, unsurprisingly, obviously, it's like a very contradictory, mixed messaging from Washington. Of course, we have the return to the maximum pressure policy. Then we hear voices from within Trump's circle, from Trump himself, and the restrainer camp in the U.S. foreign policy that do want a deal. Trump has pointed out many times how beautiful Iran is and beautiful people, and he loves it and all this kind of stuff that he says. And then he announced it yesterday while talking to Netanyahu that there will be negotiations on Saturday. He said direct negotiations in Oman. Now Iran said, and Iran's foreign minister wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying there will only be indirect negotiations. So maybe you can help us what is the what did they actually agree on at that point? I mean, probably no one really knows, but also maybe what do you think? How can and how should Iran and how can Iran actually respond also to this ambiguity and to always this kind of mixed messaging, and also to this kind of performative diplomacy of Trump, like sending letters, sending some, like, you know, trying to craft a moment that makes him look like a deal maker. Like, what options does Iran have here, like, to respond to that? How, in your opinion, should they respond to that? In these very, let's say, incoherent and unconventional dynamics, I think they also have to try to find a way to deal with that. And what would you say? What should those ways be?
Was it for me, the question?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, because I didn't get the first one. First of all, it was quite surprising to many, to most people, even in Iran, the announcement by Trump the other day when he met with Netanyahu that there's going to be talks, and actually direct talks. So there's two things here, at least. I mean, the factors that are quite important. First is the format of the negotiations, direct or indirect, what is actually going to happen. And the second is what is going to be discussed, so the content. So form and content, both are quite important. And before going into that, we shouldn't forget that it's just in the very early stages. And we have had this kind of engagement, direct or indirect, like indirect in the public eyes, maybe direct behind the scenes. We know that, for example, Iranian mission to the UN was seriously involved in direct contacts between Iran and the United States before Trump and afterwards. Such a setting of Arash and Witkov going to Oman, meeting with each other, it usually doesn't happen overnight, right? So there has been some process going on. But, what is important here is that the Iranian emphasis on indirect talks has to do with the ban, actually, that Khamenei put on the negotiations with the United States. As far as I can see, so because, many people argued after Khamenei's speech that this is just his usual maneuvering and he's going to show flexibility in the end. But this time it was quite different because as far as I could follow from people even quite close to the Pezeshkian administration, they were, I wouldn't say surprised, they were shocked because, they have been working on preparing a kind of atmosphere positive for negotiations, and then Khamenei came out and made that speech. So this kind of indirect format, to my understanding, is a middle way that Pezeshkian and his team found in order to pursue diplomacy without basically doing or saying something at least publicly that would contradict Khamenei. So, of course, it does have the green light of Khamenei himself, but what I'm going to say is that there has been a very intense domestic kind of, campaigning going on since Khamenei's speech that has led us to where we are right now. So it's already an achievement, I would say, for the reformist and centrist camp that Arash was speaking about. So from here, I would say the format doesn't matter much. It's about both sides actually having this intention to engage diplomatically. I do agree with many people who have said that, it can start indirectly and then the mediators can leave the room and, there's going to be some direct talk. So that's about the format. But what is more important is the content. So on one hand, we have Netanyahu sitting in the Oval Office speaking of the Libya model. On the other hand, we have Donald Trump, we have Steve Witkoff saying that it's only about preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. And at the same time, we have an Iran with a nuclear program that is much more advanced compared to 2015. And even if they agree to roll it back to the 2015 JCPOA level, there is still technical know-how. So the technical complexities of making sure that Iran is not going to develop a nuclear weapon is going to be quite tough. So if the Trump-Witkoff kind of approach is going to dominate the negotiations, then we are going to see positive signs. If there's going to be a pressure for dismantling of Iran's nuclear program or to go for military, I would say even on the regional file, Iran is going to show flexibility for the reason that I mentioned. Because at least in two of the three scenarios, either in the long term or short term, Iran is going to shift toward political relationship with these groups. So Iran is ready to show flexibility in the region, but not at all. I would say zero, and confidently say zero on missile and military program, because those are even more important now that the forward defense has been weakened. So this is the picture that we have. So there's good chances for Europe. Finally, just one point. It's actually striking that it seems as if Europe doesn't exist. The E3 still has a leverage in terms of the snapback mechanism, but now it's Iran engaging on one hand with Russia and China, this trilateral format, to show that it's not isolated. On the other hand, they are engaging directly, or at least kind of bilaterally, better to say, with the United States. So I cannot think of a scenario in which Iran is going to reach a deal with the Trump administration, and then the Europeans would trigger the snapback, because it would have a reverse impact. Russia and China are not going to accept it.
Also, with the other way around, it's the same. Right? If there's no deal with the US, then it's pretty likely that the EU signatories will actually, go for they will actually slap back the UN sanctions, right?
My argument is that the snapback is not going to be the most decisive factor at the moment for Iran, because based on what I can understand, Iran is preparing the ground for Russia and China not to accept the snapback. They cannot veto it, we know that. But they may come out with a statement saying that we don't accept, and it was quite evident yesterday in Moscow when they met. On the other hand, it's all about whether Trump is going to double down or reduce the sanctions. Otherwise, the snapback of the sanctions is not going to change much on the ground. And Iran is not going to actually go for leaving NPT or weaponization of its nuclear program, I think, under the Trump administration, because the risk of a military strike by the United States is quite real. They might actually take a step out of the NPT, but I really doubt that unless there is an actual strike, they are going to, even a limited one, they are going to weaponize, because that would invite a massive American and Israeli strike. So this is the situation that we have at the moment.
I want to close the panel with this in a bit, but before that, before I open it to the audience, I want to ask Arash, what do you think could Iran realistically hope to gain out of the deal? Hamid mentioned, would it focus solely on preventing Iran from acquiring, nukes? Could it also address Iran's regional role, support for groups like Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, or the Houthis, but, from the Iranian side? So what could they realistically hope to gain? Could sanctions relief be enough to entice Iran? They also kind of, over the past years, they have been sanctioned for so long, and economies kind of adapt also to sanctions over some time. So would they demand more? And what would, on the other hand, also be no-goes? And what would you also say is the public willing to, where would they say, okay, that is the price that we are willing to pay, and what, on the other hand, goes too far, would go too far?
If there was ever a time in which diplomacy and the conduct of diplomats acquired really historic proportions, and if there was a very heavy burden on the shoulders of the diplomats on both sides, that's Witkoff and Arash, who are meeting in Muscat on Saturday, this is now. There is a way to find a deal that would satisfy the both sides. It would require agility, it would require imagination a little bit. For example, let's say even something like the Libya model, because we're talking about the Libya model, and this word dismantlement is used a lot. And sometimes they say, if you notice, they say dismantle of Iran's nuclear weapons program. Well, that's possible because Iran's nuclear weapons Iran does, its official position is that it doesn't have a nuclear weapons program. Arash in his recent op-ed in Washington Post said, quoted Tulsi Gabbard to say, oh, look, this is your director of national intelligence who's saying, just like the Bush administration did back, in that very famous NIE in 2008, that we don't have a nuclear weapons program. So it is possible to get to a deal. And if Araghchi and the Iranian side really grasp this opportunity, the Trump administration is a historical opportunity for them in some ways, because, if they're able to get a big sort of a shiny deal on even, shiny on the surface, less on the sort of content, that will likely satisfy the other side, so long as they're also willing to give serious concessions on the stuff that matters. On the regional file, Iran is in a very enviable position negotiation-wise to give away things that it has already lost. So it's sort of a great position to be in. Like, you know what? I won't do this anymore. I won't do this anymore. And they don't have an actual option because they've lost all of this, right? But it could sound very big. And Trump could say, look, I did something Obama could never dream of, that Iran has lost. And this is a sentence Donald Trump is dying to say, right? And to say, now everybody's calling me a president of peace. Look, as Araghchi already sort of said in his op-ed, who would think that the Islamic Republic's top diplomat would write an op-ed to say, the president who killed Qasem Soleimani has a chance to be the president of peace, but he did, right? So I think it's a very historic opportunity. And in terms of, but I do want to agree with Hamidreza. If they want to go after Iran's missile program, that's a lost game already. Frankly, if I was advising the Iranians, I wouldn't also say to give up the weapons and program, sort of military missiles program that Iran has painstakingly built, over a very long time. And, if you're going to give up your weapons program in fear of getting attacked, you might as well go for the attack. And the last thing I want to say in this regard is that, sanctions relief is important. Obviously, any degree, yes, it's true that Iran has suffered from sanctions for so long and all that, but, any degree of sanctions relief can be important. When I'm saying, just Iran and US talking helps the Iranian real, you can imagine how, what kind of huge boon to the economy would be if there was some sort of a deal. There's also now, since Trump is thought to be economically oriented, there is thought to be not just sanctions relief, but maybe there can be investment, maybe we can have some economic deal. Some of that is wishful thinking, but I think it's possible. But I want to also say that right now, the main motivation for Iran in the talks is not really just sanctions relief, but it's avoiding military attacks. It's quite clear to all sides that if these talks fail, there will be attacks. And that really conditions, Trump says that very openly. That has always been the case, but Trump says that very openly, and that really conditions the talks in both negative and positive ways. Iran doesn't also want to give concessions, thinking, well, we can't, alternative is attacks, so it doesn't sort of want to show too much weakness and all that. But I do believe there's a historic chance for this negotiations to work, and I think Araghchi and Witkov have, as I said, the weight of sort of history on their shoulders. And Araghchi, unlike Pezeshkian, has been given some powers, right? There has been some consensus within regime bodies that here's the guy speaking for the Islamic Republic. Whether he can carry it out and not call back Tehran every 6 minutes and as a result sort of lose the momentum of the talks, these are things we're going to see. Oh, just one more point I wanted to say. This direct, indirect, I think Hamidreza already sort of gestured at this. Basically, the Iran insisting the talks are indirect is an entirely face-saving mechanism at this point. I've spoken to people in Tehran. It's quite clear what's going to happen Saturday is that Araghchi and Witkov will be in the same room. The Omani foreign minister would also be there. He'll likely leave at some point. But, if the three of us go for lunch, it's very unusual to say this is an indirect lunch between two people because someone else is also there. So that's really the conditions. These are as direct talks as any that will take place on Saturday.
Yeah, as you also when I read Arash's piece in the Washington Post, I was also they seem to have really also understood how Trump works. How he ended this piece in saying, you could be the president of peace, basically. Also because what Trump wants more than anything, the Peace Nobel Prize, as we said yesterday already. So that could actually work. This kind of charm offensive. But also maybe we end with this. I want to address this question to both of you. We have. As we already said, we have these two competing camps in U.S. foreign policy. We have the restrainers around Witkov, even Vance, Colby. We have, on the other side, the as we called them yesterday, neocons, Walz, Hexat, Rubio, and we also have a very vocal hawk in Tel Aviv, I would say, who kind of, acts like the Republican congressman of Israel and who's like really hard to sideline in Washington at this point. So, and as you said, Hamid, I mean, when really the EU would snap back UN sanctions and then Iran would leave the NPT, that could then also be the opportunity for Netanyahu to say, okay, now there is no whatsoever monitoring on the nuclear program of Iran anymore. So now this is the time for, joint actions of Israel and the US to attack Iran. And you said you don't think that is going to happen. But what about the other way around? Like if could Israel now talk Trump into something like preemptive strikes on the nuclear program? Or maybe, also on the leadership, as we've seen it here in Lebanon or elsewhere also, could that then also, do you think, lead Iran to actually start weaponizing their program, which, according to some experts, would not take much longer than 3 to 9 months or 12 months, no one really knows. So do you see that danger at this moment also that actually Netanyahu could, if something goes wrong on Saturday or whatsoever, talk Trump into this kind of action? And then we open it for the public here.
I would say, the snapback, the deadline for the expiry of the sunset clauses of the JCPOA is October, right? So if the snapback is going to be activated, it must be in September, the latest. End of summer. I would say it's not going to take that long. By that time, we are going to already know whether there is going to be at least some meaningful movement towards an agreement between Iran and the United States or not. So in that case, if the ongoing diplomatic efforts fail in at least moving the sides toward the technical aspects of a deal, and then putting together some actual agreement. If those efforts fail, we are going to see a military attack already before September, I would say, already before Europe even acts to activate the snapback. So I think the whole snapback question, the whole snapback topic is, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but less relevant at the moment, taking into account all other factors that exist. So this is one thing. On the other hand, it is quite clear that, again, this time, regardless of the content, there is a clear desire to prioritize the diplomatic option over a military option in the Trump administration, at least as far as Trump himself is concerned. And we know that he's in a way acting like a supreme leader, right? So there's a limit to in the extent to which others have an influence in the final decisions, which is a good point, a positive sign. So in that sense, I would say Israel and Netanyahu specifically, despite the resentment of any scenario in which Iran maintains its nuclear infrastructure. Despite that, because of the way that Trump has been acting, and we saw that in the Oval Office already, and they are not going to take any unilateral action, at least in the sense of a strike or something. The gray zone activities, like some assassinations, like some sabotage to provoke, these cannot be ruled out. But still, I think that's going to be risky. So I would end by saying that the next 2-3 months are going to be quite decisive, and everything depends on a progress in Iran-US diplomacy. If that doesn't happen, and with all the military buildup that is unprecedented, at least in quite a long time in the region, I would say a military confrontation between Iran and the United States Israel, United States, or the United States is going to be quite likely.
Arash, you agree to that assessment?
About the possibility of the attacks,
Yeah.
because it was a sort of, yes, I believe the possibility of attacks are real. I think the danger is very real, and I think this gives the talks sort of the extra importance, that they are the way to avoid these attacks. And I think there are different sides in the Trump White House, as you mentioned. Although I would say some of the neocons are not necessarily, let's say someone like Marco Rubio. My personal take is that we have to remember, first of all, he has a national conservative side, and also he's what I call a hemispherist, right? His focus is in the Western Hemisphere. So even someone like Rubio is, I think, a little skeptical of U.S. getting entangled there. Also, his situation is a bit like Pezeshkian in Tehran. I'm not sure how much say he will have on some of the grand matters President Trump decides. But I think folks like Prime Minister Netanyahu and others can have important influences there. Although again, when I say dream opportunity for Tehran, the way Donald Trump sent Netanyahu home disappointed, this would never happen under Biden. Sort of almost a public dissing of an Israeli prime minister in the Oval Office, happened under Obama to a much smaller degree, I would say, mostly sort of self-inflicted, even on the other side, I would say. But it would never happen under Biden. I don't think it would happen under Harris, but it did happen, under Trump just earlier this week. So, anyways, yes, I think the danger of the attacks are very real, and which gives these talks ever more importance. But as I said, no one also likes to negotiate under the sword of Damocles, right? So, that also colors the talks.
Thank you very much, you two, until here. So since we started a bit later, I think we can take 15 more minutes for questions there. No, it's 10. Okay.